Hey folks, welcome back to class, and I hope that you're having a good Wednesday so far. You can see that my cat has joined me in my lap, something I would usually edit out, but because we're talking about Laurie Anderson and we're talking about Donna Haraway today, two people who are very interested in the relationship between humans and animals, and the relationship between animals and machines, I thought it would make sense not to cut her out, at least at first. So this is Toyin. She's named after a Czech surrealist artist, and she's a very good cat. Anyway, so just logistically, real quick, before we get started on our main discussions today, there are two things that I wanted to remind you about. So the first thing is that your workshops are due tomorrow, or your workshops begin tomorrow. So please do send me an email and reach out to me to schedule a time for us to meet. As we did last time, I thought that our workshop discussions were really productive last time, and I'm really looking forward to them this time. And I wanted to remind you that I did push the due date for the performance to Tuesday instead of Monday, so you can schedule your workshop time with me anytime today during my office hours if you want to get in touch, or Thursday during my office hours or during our class period. And then you can also make an appointment to talk to me on Friday or Monday, or for some reason it has to be over the weekend. We can talk about that too. So in any case, there's a lot of flexibility here about where you schedule your workshops. I would just encourage you to schedule a workshop with me when you feel like you are ready to talk about the progress you've made so far. But ideally, I would talk to many of you tomorrow during our assigned workshop day. The second thing in relationship to that I wanted to remind you about is that for our workshops tomorrow, I also, and this, I want you to do this tomorrow, if at all possible. I want you to send to your peer group the worksheet that you've been working on, that where you're sketching out your original plans, and that is on the assignment prompt. Yeah, the second page of the assignment prompt. And I want you to talk to your peers about your projects and see if they have any ideas of things that you could build on. I would really be interested in you having these correspondences with your peers as an opportunity to learn from one another. So please send your workshop sheets to your peers tomorrow, and then in corresponding with each other, you decide that each one of you will respond to one or two of your peers, and then just give them a couple of comments about things you'd like to see them build on, or things that you think are working really well, or things that they might consider or do differently. And I'll send out an email tomorrow with those instructions on how I would like you to respond to your peers. I also just wanted to briefly remind you that tomorrow your responses to your peers' last performances are also due on forums as usual. So please make sure that you post those as well. And remember, if you have any questions about that, there are specific instructions for how you should do that on assignment prompts under Sakai as well. So those are the logistical things. So again, that's just your workshops are tomorrow. Please make sure you make an appointment with me. Please make sure you're sending your peer groups your evaluation forms. And then finally, remember that your peer evaluations are of the last performances of the spoken word performances are due tomorrow. So that's all the logistic stuff that I think that we have to talk about today. So our main lectures today then are going to cover Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto, which I had asked you to read the first two sections of, and then Susan McClary's piece on Laurie Anderson's work. And I think that these are very complementary. When we talk about Laurie Anderson, I'm going to give you a few examples of videos to watch that I think communicate some of these ideas very well. And some of these clips I'll also put alongside our discussion of Haraway. The main ways in which I think about these two pieces you read as complementing each other is that, well, first of all, they both explore the relationship between gender and technology. The second one specifically thinking about the way that technology and gender relate to performance, although I think some discussion of performance is implicit in Haraway's arguments as well. So I think that that is the main substance of our discussion today, and I think a really interesting one that I'm excited to have, which is how does technology technology fit into the equation of what we've been talking about so far in terms of gender, patriarchy, and sexism, in terms of heteronormativity? How can we think about technology as something that maybe enforces those binaries in certain ways, but also in other ways maybe might let us transgress those boundaries, or might let us think of alternative ways to perform gender? There are also ways in which technology has, from its very beginning, been conceived as a way to maybe move past some of these social inequities. There's a very famous cartoon from the very early days of the internet that has two dogs sitting together at a desktop computer, and one of the dogs is typing, and it says, "On the internet, no one knows you're a dog." And that's very silly, but there was a while in which, in this sort of utopian or really optimistic perception of what the internet would do, people thought it was going to break down racism and break down sexism because it takes you out of your body, theoretically, because you don't appear as yourself when you're just chatting with people on servers. But in our experience, that has not been true. Racism and sexism and misogyny are things that perhaps the internet has only intensified. So thinking about these relationships then is something that's really important, I think, for our contemporary moment. It is also, I think, important for us to think about this in terms of our multi-text performances, because multi-text performances are a place where we are getting the opportunity to bring in technology, whether that is music making technology, whether that's video technology. We're bringing in other forms of media to help enhance or change this performance. So I think that it's interesting to think about, especially because these performances are performances of race or performances of gender, or rather are exploring the performativity of both of those things. It's really important to think about the politics of, the consequences of, or the impact of incorporating these other mediums and the relationship with technology, or that we put ourselves into with technology in the process of making these multi-text performances. So that's the general frame for our discussion today. So we're going to start out by talking about Donna Haraway, and then we're going to move on to talking about McClary's piece, although they are complementary, and I'll probably put some video clips in the outline along the way to give us examples of Laurie Anderson's work, even when we're just talking about Haraway, because there are definite convergences here, or definite resonances here, not just between, I think, McClary and Haraway, but between Haraway and Laurie Anderson herself. I think that their work explores really similar ideas, and I think that that's something that is interesting to see examples of. And then we'll move on to talk about McClary's piece a little bit more briefly, where she actually applies or analyzes Haraway's performances and thinks about the relationship between gender and technology by analyzing Anderson's performances. I think I just said Haraway's performances, but McClary analyzes Laurie Anderson's performances and uses that to discuss and make arguments about the relationship between technology and gender and performance. So that's the basic roadmap of our discussion today. So I'm just going to pause it real quick, and then we're going to pick up talking about Haraway. I do want to say one last prefatory thing is that I know that Haraway is hard. Part of her difficulty, I think, is a playfulness or a joy in writing. She also is brilliant. Her work just drips with intellect. So parts of this are really difficult for me to understand, even though I've read this piece probably 5 or 6 times now. Parts of this are the things that are difficult for professors to really understand. So don't worry, again, like with Butler, if some of the language escapes you, if you don't really understand some of the philosophy or the political theory that she's talking about. That's not really what's important to us. When I lecture today, I'm just going to extract from Haraway what I think is important to our understanding of the relationship between gender, performance, and technology, and then we'll make that more concrete through our discussion of Laurie Anderson and through our discussion of McClary's piece. So stay tuned. This isn't a lecture break. I'm just going to pause it real quick, and then we're going to get into talking about Haraway. So to get started with Haraway then, she calls her piece a cyborg manifesto. And the subtitle uses the phrase ironic myth, which is something that we're going to have to unpack a little bit because that is sort of vague and contradictory language, and we need to think about what it really means. So let's start there then and think about irony and mythology to start out with. So irony, Haraway actually defines for us in the opening pages, and she uses a specific definition, which I also think is a very succinct definition of irony, which is a way of looking at the world or a thing that we express in which contradictions do not fully disappear, in which contradictions do not fully disappear, in which contradictions are part of the point in some ways and cannot be resolved. So she is going to talk about the central irony in the myth of the cyborg as being that our relationships with technology are things that come from the like military technological developments. So the internet, for instance, was developed by the military or as a military technology first. They come from our relationships to capitalism and to industrial capitalism, and that is something that Anderson, at least, or not Anderson, sorry, Haraway is critical of as a writer. And so we can think then about technology and the state of 21st century, 20th century when Haraway was writing, the state of technology in contemporary life. We can think about that as being in some ways indebted to, right, or coming from a history of violence and domination, would be her argument. And we'll unpack that a little bit more in a second. But when we think about technology, typically we do not think about feminism. And this is an important part of the intervention that both Haraway and McClary are making, is that technology is usually thought to be something that belongs to the world of the masculine, belongs to the world of men, and comes from, as we said, these traditions, the traditions of militarism, the traditions of advanced industrial capitalism that have historically enforced patriarchy, enforced racism, not been great for women and great for average individuals. So this is one of the ironies then, because she is going to celebrate the figure of the cyborg in some ways, but she's always going to remind us that we have to also understand that our relationships with technology have these problematic backgrounds, and so we have to understand both of those things at the same time. And because those things are contradictory, that's ironic, yeah, for her, is that those contradictions cannot resolve, so we're thinking about it as ironic in this way. So a myth then, the other part of the term, is to say that when we think about a fable or a story or a figure that is supposed to represent something, is a representation of a set of values or a set of ideas inside of society that we then aspire to or orient our lives around. So when she talks about cyborgs as a feminist myth, what she's talking about is how can we use the figure of the cyborg, the metaphor of the cyborg, as something to think about the possibilities for feminism. So if you put these things together then, what she's saying is that in introducing this figure of the cyborg, she's not necessarily speaking literally, although we'll complicate that a little bit, but she's not saying we are all now cyborgs in the sense that we are literally have our bodies assembled with other things, or there is machinery inside of our bodies, which for some people is true now, but she doesn't mean it in that specific and literal way. She means to use the cyborg as an image for what it might look like to think of a world beyond gender, beyond patriarchy, to think about an alternative world. But the myth is, again, ironic because she wants to say, at the same time, the opportunities that the cyborg affords, the place that the cyborg comes from, its history, is something that is politically problematic. And so there is always this contradictory nature to thinking about the future of feminism through the figure of the cyborg. But she is going to argue that this is a valuable figure, she thinks, and is one that we can use productively to think through feminism and its relationship to technology. So the cyborg then is something of a political myth. It's something somewhat fictional that we imagine because, as we'll talk about in her description, it gives us an alternative to the way that we conceptualize the relationship between gender and individuals and humanity and the technological and the biological world. So she thinks that the cyborg helps us productively rethink the way that we usually think about those differences between the human, the non human animal, and the technological. At the same time, she wants to say it's not quite a fiction still. It's not quite a fiction because in both science fiction, we see the cyborg for sure, but we also see it in our lived experience every day. She talks about how medicine, for instance, is full of cyborgs, and this is something that we can really think about in our present context of COVID. It's very interesting, I think, for us to consider the ways in which, without systems that allow us to put our bodies in relationship to machines, for instance, without ventilators, many more people would have died from COVID 19 than already have died for COVID 19. So, our relationships with technology, our relationships with medical technology, sustain oftentimes our lives. So, we are inserted into these technological systems. We become part machine, part human in order to maintain our own human existences. So in medicine, then, we see a literal example a lot of times of the ways in which we are subject to or put in relationship with technologies. She also doesn't, I mean, and another example of this that I think is relevant to consider is the idea of smartphones. And smartphones did not exist when Haraway was writing this essay, but they do now. And you can think about how so many of your daily activities are filtered through this lens of your phone, that this is where how you decide what the weather is. This is where you keep all of your photographs. So you sort of outsource your memories. You also outsource your memory of, for instance, your friends' phone numbers to your phone. You outsource the memory of your friends' birthdays to Facebook. You outsource all of your communicative capabilities and your information gathering to the apps you use on your phone. So these ways in which you then take part of your own experience, your socialization, your information processing, things like that, and put them into a technological device, and then you exist in a close and symbiotic relationship to that device, we could call that, and I think Haraway would call that a move toward the cyborg, even though you aren't like literally putting the phone in your body, although that might be the next step. And some people, I mean, you might have heard of this phenomenon called biohacking, when some people are literally interested in crossing these boundaries and to trying to integrate technologies into their own physical bodies. But for Haraway, it doesn't have to be integrated into your physical body to count as a cyborg. You just have to be in a relationship with the machine so that your experience and is not possible or is qualitatively changed because you're in relationship with this technology. Because you're in relationship with this technology. So that is the general way we want to conceive of the cyborg then, as on the one hand, something that is figurative, something that's mythological, that's supposed to help us think about alternatives to the way that we structure the world right now, and on the other hand, something that is literal, because we do exist in these ensemble or these relationships with technologies all the time. So much of our world is a cyborg world, Haraway would argue. So the next part of the introduction is when I think she transitions a little bit to talk about why this is uniquely important to feminism. Why this is uniquely important to feminism. So she talks about first how cyborg replication, so by that she means reproduction, is uncoupled from organic reproduction. And by that she means sexual reproduction. And she refers here to invertebrates insects and ferns, because those are two biological organisms that can reproduce by themselves without the requirement of another sexual partner of an opposite sex. So she says then that in both the machine and in the organic world, we see examples of heterosexual relationships not being a mandate, of there not being an innate or natural biological, or sorry, binary sex opposition. So this is something then that she very much agrees with the conversations we've been having so far, and there is a passage in this text in which she very much makes the same argument that biological sex has been determined by gender and not vice versa, that both Bornstein and Butler made last time. So that is, I think, one of the important connections to our ongoing discussions of feminism, is that cyborg replication, the idea of thinking about cyborgs as a feminist myth, is to think about the possibility of a society that reproduces without that reproduction being necessarily heteronormative, binary, or even sexual in nature. And so part of what matters a lot here, if you think about this, is when we talked about Butler last time, we talked about how she argues that the reason why there is the heterosexual imperative or contract, the reason why there is these scripts that determine us as being either men or women and compel us to enter into heterosexual relationships many of the times, is because of kinship systems, is because there is a social imperative to reproduce through sexual reproduction. So, in a circumstance then where that imperative did not exist, she is arguing, then it might be possible for us to think about alternatives to the heterosexual imperative, alternatives to binary gender identity imperatives, that if we don't have that social necessity to biologically reproduce, that new identities might become possible. And this is also where an important connection comes in terms of her discussions of socialism. I'm not really going to get into the Marxism-socialism debate that she talks about. We haven't spent enough time talking about it to really flesh that out. But something that's really important is that feminist Marxists oftentimes make that same argument that Butler argues about kinship systems, but in relationship to capitalism. That is, so for instance, a feminist Marxist named Silvia Federici makes the argument that women do housework and also reproduce the emotional labor in the emotional well-being of the family. So they make the meals, they care for the children, they make the husband worker feel better about himself after a long day when they bring the pipe and the slippers. And so the idea is that capitalism requires both the literal reproduction of people to work, so it requires women to, in this case, give biological birth to children, and it requires the reproduction of one's ability to work by being nurtured. So Silvia Federici's argument is that, much like Butler's argument, that the heterosexual imperative and the gender binary and sexism and patriarchy more generally exist to sustain capitalism, So in either case then, the idea of being freed from organic reproduction as labor reproduction, or as the reproduction of the community or the society or of the economy, might break open the need for those binary restrictions. So that is the first major point she makes, and I think that that's a really interesting one that we want to keep in mind, is that this idea is, as we move forward in technological progress. So for instance, now if you are in a lesbian relationship, for instance, you can go to a sperm donor or find a sperm donor and have a child without actually needing to have physical sex with a man. And in those circumstances, then technology allows for this sort of reproduction when otherwise it might not have been possible. So in terms of thinking about cyborgs, then, what she's trying to talk about is how in the future orientation of the world might not be as restrictive in this way that we've been talking about. The second important intervention she makes is by saying that the cyborg does not have an original unity. It is instead committed to partiality, irony, intimacy, and perversity. And what this is to say is that, and she'll talk about this in the second section of the essay in a lot more detail, is that women do not have an original unified status. All women are not originally the same, as many feminists might claim, or some feminists might claim. That there is no original unity of mankind, that there's no original unity of humanity, that everything has always been partial in relationship to one another, shot through by power, that our search for some sort of natural identity, whether that is something essentially true about all women, something that is essentially true about all members of a race or ethnicity, something that is essentially true about all members of a class, that any search for that sort of original unity is bound to fail because we don't come from, in her perspective, a unified origin, that we come from production and synthesis and relationships and contingency. So we can't think about then there being one unified origin of the world that we want to get back to. What we have to think about is how we communicate and build bridges between difference, between partial perspectives. So the idea that we should all arrive at something that is universally true for all humans and that that's the condition for us to all get along, Haraway says no, that the condition for political advancement is actually to learn how to work in between differences, to learn how to bring people who are different together because everybody is different. The next main intervention that she wants to make after that, which is, I think, related to the first one, is that in general, we've talked about so far in this class is there being this idea of the subject-object divide. That is, as humans, you are the subject, and the world outside, the natural world, the technological world, is an object for your exploitation. What Haraway says is that the cyborg myth reverses that. She says, quote, "Nature and culture are reworked. The one can no longer be the resource for appropriation or incorporation by the other. That is, we can no longer think about there being a coherent distinction between nature and culture where one uses the other thing. And that the cyborg myth is about breaking down that boundary between subject and object and saying that we are all in relationships with other subjects and other objects, and that those relationships determine how the world works. It is not that one dominates the other in all circumstances, or gets to appropriate the other in all circumstances. So, when Haraway is talking about technology, and also when Laurie Anderson is talking about technology, I think it's really, really important that we think about the ways in which they're not arguing that women should exert their power over technology to compete with the way that men exert their power over technology. They're arguing that working in relationship with technology is possible to create a relationship between you and the world in which you aren't trying to dominate it, in which you're not trying to make it into one thing, but you're instead working with or alongside technology, or with or alongside nature, and collaborating and producing something. So, in this way, you might think back to the idea that we were talking about in the pedagogy of the oppressed, that in a subject-object relationship between teacher and student, the student is just molded by the teacher, instead of you helping in the instruction process. The idea behind this is very similar, that we treat nature and objects in the world as if they are things to be exploited, but we actually have to look at the way they are active participants in constructing the world, the way that they're not that much different than us, and that they perform in our day-to-day activities. They make our life happen. So finally then, she concludes this section by saying, illegitimate offspring are often exceedingly unfaithful to their origins, which is a great pull quote, I think, but you want to contextualize that in terms of our discussion of the ironic myth, which we've already talked about in decent detail, which is to say that in the figure of the cyborg, or when we think about technology, we do think about the military-industrial complex. We do think about the history of industrial capitalism and environmental extraction and the destruction of the environment that comes along with those things. So the cyborg then is a product of a system that Haraway and others want to critique. But at the same time, she says, illegitimate offspring of these systems can turn against their origins and work to undo them. So she wants to say then that just because the cyborg comes from this problematic origin, that doesn't mean that it is in and of itself something that is necessarily politically bad, that it can be used as this mythic figure to think about alternatives to the way the world is now, even though it comes from those things, insofar as it is unfaithful to those origins, insofar as the cyborg illustrates or rebels against the system that, illustrates the flaws of or rebels against the systems that it produces, or that produces it, rather. So that is, again, to say that because cyborgs come from something that is problematic, that doesn't mean they're not a productive way of thinking about the future of gender, as so long as we can use them to think through the ways in which those systems are flawed, that produce them, and think through the ways in which the cyborg may, at the same time, be problematic. And that's the idea of irony. We're thinking about what is good and what is bad, and holding them together at the same time. So next, we're just going to go really quickly through the first section, because we've talked about this, I think, a lot. I mean, I think that most of the highlights of the essay we basically captured in this introductory discussion, but the boundary breakdown she talks about here, I think, are really important. So I just want to go through these really quickly. So she says that the great binary distinctions between us and other things in the world in the 20th century are breaking down before our eyes, And she talks about three boundaries here. The boundaries between humans and animals, between animals and machines, and the boundaries between the physical and the non-physical. The boundaries of the physical and the non-physical. So in terms of human-animal boundaries, we want to think about things like language and rationality and tool use. These are things that have usually been used to say humans are qualitatively different than animals. So some people, for instance, have said that that is true because humans use language and no other animals use language. But as philosophers like John Durham Peters have argued, that's not true. Dolphins seem to have a relatively sophisticated language. Whales also seem capable of talking to one another, and the ways in which they use language might be fundamentally different from ours, and the ways in which their linguistic systems work might be different than ours, but it does seem as if other animals have language. Crows can use tools. Crows can remember human faces. Crows can abstractly problem solve. Obviously, chimps and gorillas have been capable of using sign language. I actually watched a bunch of videos with my partner last night of somebody who was training a dog named Bunny to learn how to use English. So the argument here is that the boundaries between humans and animals are starting to break down. And Haraway's also writing at a time in which animal rights activism is getting a lot more popular, and people are starting to stress too how animals are capable of suffering. So as agents capable of experiencing pain, they're not so much different than us, even if they don't have the same cognitive abilities. So whatever distinction we want to say, makes something a human, this makes something an animal, she's saying that distinction is arbitrary for the most part, that it goes away when it is held up to scrutiny, that we are animals, and we need to embrace the fact that we are animals. Similarly, she wants to say that the boundaries between animals and machines are breaking down. The boundaries between animals and machines are breaking down. So I don't want to spend too much time going into this again because we just talked about this as the idea of the cyborg. But something that is really important about this discussion of the breakdown between animals and machines is that one of the things that postmodernist and post-structuralist philosophers have been arguing up until the time in which Haraway is writing, and is a really popular position, is that we interpret society through its text, through what people say, through its discourse, through its laws, through its rules, but all of those things are A, textual, they have to do with language, but B, are produced by humans, that we have to get down into the materiality of the world, that we have to understand the ways in which objects actively construct our social reality, technologies actively construct our reality, and the world is not just made in thought. The world is not just made in thought, but it's made in bodies, it's made in technologies, it's made in the material world, and we're articulated with those things and interact with those things all the time. All the time. And finally, she wants to say that the boundary between the physical and the non-physical is breaking down. And by that, she means, for instance, the boundary between information and physical reality. So she talks here about the way in which you think about, for instance, a computer chip, that computer chips physically encode data onto them using electricity and transmit information by transmitting something material, electricity, data signals in binary code that are then decoded. Telephones actually do something relatively similar, but telephones have a direct signal. They aren't encoded and then decoded at the other end of the line. So the idea here, anyway, is just to say that the ways in which the technology is developing, it makes things like language, makes things like thought or images, all of these things that we think about as being non-material, as being cognitive, or as being symbolic, they can be coded and materially reproduced and circulated, and that they can become in that way material, and that indeed anything we think about as being non-physical actually depends on the physical in order to exist at all. So I'm talking to you right now. I am making a physical sound with my throat. It's not as if my words are just immaterial. So that is, all of this is to say then, that Haraway's arguments are things that are particularly true in the 21st century or in the 20th century as these boundaries are increasingly collapsing, but were always true to a certain extent. There were always other animals that used symbols. We have always used machines as part of our evolution. These types of relationships have always been fluid. And what she wants to argue then is this idea that we have to create this notion of there being a real essence to humanity that we can all rally around, that there has to be this real clear fixed boundary between what a woman is and what a man is, that any of these boundaries have to be fixed. That's really the problem. That everything has always been partial and relational, and that we have to understand the way that our relationships with the human world, the technological world, and the non-human world all work together to socially construct what is real for us and to give us our perspectives on the world. So transitioning to the next section then, this section is something that is going to be in particular important to those of you who are really interested in feminism, and is not something that I think we need to spend too much time digging into the nitty-gritty of, but given the nature of our discussion so far, I think it's really important that we go through and discuss some of the ways in which Haraway's feminism differs from the feminism of others or incorporates insights from other forms of feminism. So she talks about here two authors that I want to stress in particular, Sandoval and McKinnon, both of who are very influential feminist authors. So she talks about how Sandoval, who talks about how women of color have unique experiences, and that women of color need to build coalitions and work together to advance their their own personal feminist causes, that her argument for the way in which women of color have unique experiences, A, reflective of something we would call intersectionality now, or the idea of standpoint theory, which is actually something that Haraway talks about a lot. And both of these are just to say that one's particular identity, as it brings together multiple different social or cultural identities, creates a unique experience. So the experience of a woman of color is different than the experience of a white woman. But there are also internal differences to the experiences of women of color. There are also internal differences to the experiences of white women. And to be a white queer woman or to be a queer woman of color is again different. To be a queer white man is to be different than to be a cisgender or a heterosexual identifying white man. That all of these unique perspectives are different, and that when we live in these social positions, we have a different perspective on the world. That is something that Haraway is all for, that she thinks this is absolutely true. And she thinks that one of the things that Sandoval's argument reveals is that we can't think about there being a collective or universal women's experience, or a collective or universal experience at all from which we could build a feminist movement. That feminist movements have to be about bringing different identities together. And she then opposes this against the idea that McKinnon propagates, which is that women actually do have a unified experience, and that experience is that their worlds are configured in relationship to male desire, that their worlds are configured in relationship to male desire. So Haraway in this way interprets McKinnon as saying that the universal quality of being a woman is that of non-being. That is, you are always subordinate, you are always secondary, so you don't actually exist for yourself, you only exist for men. Haraway is incredibly critical of this claim. She thinks that it cancels out all of the particularity of women's experience, and also cancels out the possibility that different women from different cultures have different experiences. So she says then that we need to, in some way, split the difference between these perspectives on feminism, between a perspective that says that everything is radically different, and that difference is infinite between people of different subject groups or different positions, and that says that all women are the same, or that there are universal experiences that can be afforded to women or women of color or any sort of group of people, that we can say that they have experiences that define them as a group. She wants to say that both of these are risky, because in the first section, and this is a quote, she says, we risk lapsing into boundless difference and giving up on the confusing task of making partial real connection. So that is, if we just say everybody is different, and pluralism is like, which is to say that there are a plurality or a number of different viewpoints, to say that everybody is different and there is this radical pluralism in the world, that has benefits for sure, but to say that we should just say that that means we should never try to resolve those differences or build connections in spite of those differences is really problematic, because then the world is just infinite difference and nobody can ever get along. It turns into the sort of radical individuality, everybody for themselves, everybody only for their self-interest. There's no such thing as identification, that is more typical of a like cutthroat, competitive capitalist life system than one that she wants to describe. So we don't want to say we are fundamentally different to the point where we can't connect, but we also don't want to say we are all the same and there is no such thing as difference. She says in concluding this section then that some differences are playful, some are poles of world historical systems of domination. Epistemology is about knowing the difference. And this then we're concluding on one of her central terms, which is epistemology. So we've talked about ontology before as the study of being. Epistemology is the study of ways of knowing or different points of views of the world. So, what she's saying here is that epistemology, the study of how we know, the study of how we understand or construct knowledge in the world, allows us to determine when the differences that we encounter in the world are playful or profitable, and when the differences we encounter in the world are the productions of systems of domination. So we could think about then how the idea of sexuality as a spectrum says that sex is something that is, or sexual orientation is something that is playful, that is not rigid, that the differences between different sexual orientations are things that only matter insofar as they are exploratory, but that talking about binary difference is part of a system of domination that excludes everybody who's not in the middle, and that we need to be able to be critical of the way in which some modes of thought are playful and embrace difference in a positive and productive way, and the relationships we've been talking about between humans and animals, between animals and machines, between humans and machines in a productive and playful and interesting way, and those that, on the other hand, embrace them in terms of systems of domination, that, for instance, articulate humans and machines together just so machines can dominate humans or humans can dominate machines, that put humans in relationship to animals just so that humans can dominate animals, that those sorts of differences are destructive, whereas a plurality of differences where we say there are partial variations between us, but we also have partial commonalities, and we should build coalitions together to advance our shared political causes, even though we are not identical, is how we can think about building productive political coalitions in the future. So with that larger theoretical rundown of Haraway's work in place, I then just want to conclude our discussion by thinking about two particular examples from Laurie Anderson's work. Two particular examples from Laurie Anderson's work before we turn to McClary. So the first thing that I want you to do is watch the video clip that I've included at the end of the document, where Laurie Anderson is narrating or discussing her relationship with her dog. This is an excerpt from her documentary that she made about her dog, who she also was teaching how to play music, how to interact with her. And I want you to think about the discussion we've been having so far in relationship to this video. The second thing that I want you to do is to listen to the song that I linked to Laurie Anderson, which is an alternative telling of the Adam and Eve story, an alternative telling of the Adam and Eve story. And this is where the title of McClary's essay, "This is not a story my people tell," comes from. So I want you to think about that second example in relationship to the discussion that we had in our introduction about how the myth of the cyborg is in some ways about rewriting our origin stories in a way that doesn't demand there was this original unity or this original state in which women were dominated or were subordinate to men, in which nature was subordinate to men and women, in which everybody was subordinate to the unity of God. That this myth that Laurie Anderson tells maybe thinks about a plural or a feminist origin story to the world. So please just watch these two examples, and then we will pick up in the next lecture on our discussion of McClary.